Hi everyone, this is Shelly. Welcome to the Open Measurement Software Development Kit webinar. This is a show and tell session. As most of you may be aware, that we released the first version of the Open Measurement SDK last month, and we are organizing this webinar uh, to showcase the capabilities, the how do you integrate, and other details. So welcome back, welcome, and good morning to all those from Asia, and good evening to anybody who's joining from the US continent here, America's continent. We'll get straight into it. So we're going to cover a little bit about what the Open Measurement Working Group is. Then we'll get into the details on what the OM SDK is and how it works. Then we'll go into the onboarding details, like how do you get the SDK, how do you download it, and then we'll have a detailed walkthrough on how do you integrate it on both platforms, iOS and Android. Then we'll get into a little bit details once you've integrated, how do you actually execute campaigns, and then after that we'll get into the adoption, some details about expected timelines, guidance from MRC, and compliance, and then we'll discuss a little bit about future roadmap at the end of this webinar. So before we get to that, just wanted to introduce Tech Lab for some who may not be aware of us or are not our members. That the Tech Lab is a nonprofit R&D consortium that produces standards, software, and we also offer services. The main objective being to drive effective and sustainable global digital media ecosystem. These are some of our board of directors who are the governing body at the Tech Lab. And we partner with a lot of the other trade organizations like IAB US and IAB, regional IABs across the world, Ad ID, the Coalition for Better Ads, the DAA, the MRC tag, W3C, and some more. So our strategy is basically to offer services, software, and standards to create a transparent, safe, and effective supply chain. To have a simpler and more consistent measurement, and to enable better marketing or advertising experiences for consumers with focus on mobile and TV channel enablement. And we do this by way of providing standards, the specs, protocols, technical guidelines like MRAID, VPAID, OpenRTB, VAST, and software like the Open Measurement SDK and other validation tools that we provide for you to validate your implementations. And then, of course, we offer compliance services to certify the implementations of specific protocols or softwares to ensure that one, they interoperate and they're properly integrated or implemented as expected. The Open Measurement Working Group was created about a year back to work specifically on the problem for viewability, in-app viewability. We have 45 companies as members today in the working group. It is governed by a commit group which has 6 members: Pandora, Google, Integral AdScience, Mote from Oracle, and Double Verify and Comscore. So commit group is has been leading the open measurement effort by providing engineering resources for sustainable development, as well as governing the roadmap and requirements and managing the overall working group efforts. Since we released on April 10 last month, we've had over 50 plus downloads from all over the globe. And these are some representative companies that have requested downloads. So we look forward to all of these companies integrating the OM SDK in the coming days. So for today's webinar, we have speakers from all of the commit group companies. All of them have worked hard over the last 1 year in making this happen and being able to release the software. We have Joe Ranzenbach from IAS, Alex from Pandora, Brad from Google. Ron from MRC will not be present in this one. He was present in our morning session earlier, so I'll cover for him. We have Sar from Double Verify, Kevin from ComScore, Michael from Oracle, and we have Mayank from IAB Tech Lab, who's been part of this effort along with me, as well as I want to acknowledge Meena, who's helped set up all of this and help us set up the whole webinar and managing the webinar. So with that, we'll just get started right away. Joe and Kevin, I'll hand it to you.
All right, thank you. All right, so the inability to measure at scale with true independent third-party measurement for viewability has been one of the most commonly cited inhibitors of brand spend for mobile in-app advertising. And that's basically the chief problem that we set out to solve for here, is to ensure that an advertiser will be able to run a tag and measure against measure viewability and further on verification across all of their ad spend at scale, chiefly for mobile app in this case. Go to the next slide. So there are a number of reasons why this didn't already exist at scale, and this is why there's really an industry problem that we came together to solve. So first of all, developing an SDK, which is known to be one of the best means of measuring for viewability, not only from a performance standpoint, but from a actual trust and capabilities coverage standpoint. But developing an SDK for that is a lot of work. So first of all, there are only a handful of vendors that had done it in the first place. However, there were more than one. So publishers and ad SDKs that were looking to integrate them ended up encountering, of course, black box challenges. Meaning if they counter an issue, now they have to troubleshoot with somebody else on the underlying integration and try and figure out if there are multiple integrations going, which one it's actually coming from, if there are any conflicts between them, et cetera. And adopting a new SDK obviously takes time. So if you're an ad SDK and SSP, you've got tens of thousands of publishers. Rolling out a new update to your SDK takes time, 6, 12, 18 months even for somebody to go, for your entire publisher base to go ahead and adopt that. So when you have multiple vendors that are competing for the same slots in the supply side's roadmaps, factor that with the fact that there's a long ramp up time or adoption period. So now you're looking at, if you have all multiple different vendors trying to push for this, you're looking at 4, 5, 6 years even before a single vendor has complete scale across the industry, which is really what an advertiser is looking for. They need to be able to measure at scale and do so in a way that they can trust it. And obviously, the fact that there are multiple SDKs trying to solve the same problem means that there is some redundancy. Having multiple SDKs, if you choose to support them, obviously could increase the footprint for the app, overhead, maintenance, etc. Next slide. So the MRC actually highlighted this in their viewable ad impression measurement guidelines for mobile app, that they would support the notion of a single source standard that can be used by all parties, meaning that instead of having multiple SDKs, why doesn't the industry actually align on a single SDK and therefore bring into effect all of the efficiencies that come from that? And fortunately enough, they've been incredibly supportive of this initiative basically from the start. So it's come a long way, and we're excited to have them on our team. Next slide. So what is this really doing? Well, instead of having each vendor go and have their independent, separate, proprietary SDK integrated, and basically fighting over slices of a small pie when it comes to scale, we grew the pie itself. And this means that if you think about it in comparison to web, in a web environment, any vendor's JavaScript tag can show up and execute and basically have access to the same information. And that's really what we're trying to do for mobile app. We're trying to ensure that the ability to access the data and information and signals necessary to actually calculate things like viewability, that's not the inhibitor. That a vendor is able to make those calculations, to make their own determinations, to build their own processes to validate them, without having the access to that data be the largest prevention method for them to actually to provide that measurement. So by having a standard SDK, obviously this facilitates the adoption, but it also helps with innovation, troubleshooting, et cetera. So we for members of the working group, we've made the actual underlying SDK code transparent. Obviously, integrations are with the binary and not in source form. But that enables the conversation to be larger than just the independent vendor. It brings in publishers, it brings in SSPs, it brings in buy side. And that enables us to innovate and ensure that we provide the best possible solution to the market. And we actually see benefits from this. We're protecting user experience. There's a reduced native footprint. We can improve things like user experience. The developer experience is obviously improved because there's reduced integration and maintenance efforts, and we're making great strides in ensuring that the onboarding process is as smooth and simple as possible, and we'll continue to do so, obviously. This also eliminates risk around vendor M&A. So if you had a proprietary SDK, and that vendor that had that SDK happens to be acquired, you can end up in some interesting situations. Next slide. All right, now I'll hand it over to Kenny. Or sorry, Kevin.
Thanks. That's right. Thanks, Joe. Hello. There are basically two ways that the IAB Open Measurement SDK is expected to be present within the app environment. Directly by the publisher into their app, or through the Ad Network SDK, which is then installed into the app. This slide shows a basic depiction for a typical ad with the IAB Open Measurement SDK implemented by the publisher within the app. In the publisher implementation scenario, when an ad is to be served into the app notifies the Open Measurement SDK that an ad session is started. The Open Measurement SDK creates an API. It's called the OMID API, and OMID here stands for Open Measurement Interface Definition. But that just acts as a communication between the native layer and the JavaScript that's running within the ad. The publisher ad server injects the measurement provider tag within the ad, and the Open Measurement SDK communicates through the API to the measurement provider tag that is collecting signals that includes ad offset as well as ad session events. The measurement provider tag reports this information to the measurement provider servers. Next slide, please. In the ad network implementation, it looks a little bit different. In the ad network implementation, when the ad is to be served into the app, the OM SDK is a part of the ad network or Ads SDK. The Ads SDK then notifies the Open Measurement SDK that an ad session has started. The Open Measurement SDK creates the API associated with the ad, and the ad tag from the AdNet injects the measurement provider tag with the ad. The Open Measurement SDK communicates through the API to the measurement provider tag the ad offset and ad session events, and the measurement provider tag reports that to the measurement provider servers. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's go over what is supported today. Today, there's collection and surfacing of impression and raw viewability information for ad verification. It supports display banner advertising and interstitial advertising on web view and native in-app ad units. Video advertising is supported on web view using HTML5 video or native using in-app players. Video-wise, it's designed and support is available for VAST 2, 3, 4.0, and upcoming VAST 4.1 workflow. The other areas such as brand safety and fraud detection or invalid traffic are both facilitated, but logic does not exist within the SDK to make either a blocking response or to determine whether an ad is invalid. Advertising ID retrieval logic does not exist within the SDK at this time. And vPaid is not supported by the SDK. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Shaylee and Menk.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Kevin. Before we move on to the onboarding, I just wanted to let everyone know that please feel free to ask any questions through the Q&A module on your BlueJeans screen. We will be taking up those questions towards the end of the session. So the next section in our webinar is on the onboarding, which basically addresses how to get the SDK. I'll quickly go through the process. So the first step is, of course, the registration on our portal, which is tools.iabtechlab.com. It does have an approval process because we want to ensure that that companies it's being downloaded by companies for their use. One of the reasons being that we need a namespace to avoid JavaScript conflicts in multiple instantiations. And we want to make sure that we provide a unique namespace to everyone, which is based on your company's domain name. So once you've done that step of registering and getting approved, you will get access to the SDK, and we'll have a walkthrough of all the screens in a little while, so you'll know exactly where to get what. Once you've done that, you can create a build with the namespace, or if you want multiple SDKs for different purposes, you can have multiple namespaces by creating an additional namespace. Once you've generated the build, you'll get a notification that the build has been completed, and then you can download the SDK libraries and then move on to the next step of integrating the SDK. And we'll have a walkthrough later on of detail for both the platforms, how you do that. And then after the integration, you can do the testing through the validation script that's included as part of the libraries that are provided. In addition, Tech Lab is offering a compliance service whereby we can test and certify your SDK implementation that ensures that the SDK will work with all of the measurement provider tags. In addition, you can also do specific testing with specific measurement providers. And then the last thing that we want to point out is the Om Sdk Javascript, which is what you inject at the time of initiating the ad sessions. That can get updated on a regular basis because we are on a sprint cycle of 2 weeks, so we're releasing every 2 weeks. So we're recommending that you download and update the Om Sdk JS files on a regular basis, weekly, preferably even more frequently if you can. So with that, I will hand it over to Mayank for a walkthrough of the portal.
Thanks, Shelly. Hello, everyone. So we have done up a recording session, but you can go ahead and log in and you can see exactly the same what we have recorded. Go ahead, Shelly. Can you please play it?
Yep, it's playing.
So once you go to tools.iabtechlab.com, you will land to this page. You will register yourself, and after the approval process, as Shelly said, you can log in and you will see all the various tools. The above one, which has the Open Measurement SDK, that's where the SDK build feature is implemented. So there are various tabs on the home. You can add up a namespace. You will always get up a default namespace based on your company name that we take as a namespace or a folder name or a placeholder, you can call that. You can have as many namespace as you want. You can delete it. And then on the other tabs, you will once it is built, you will get up a success email to the registered email address with the one which you have logged in. Once it is there, you can see to the iOS, Android SDK. You can navigate the documentations. The reference apps are coming soon. In case if there is a problem, you're not able to see it, please make sure that you hit refresh. That will fetch the latest build from our build system. So yeah, please go ahead and try it out. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Great. Thank you, Mike. So the next step is the integration of the actual SDK after you've downloaded it. And for that, we have Alex from Pandora, who's going to walk us through for both the iOS and the Android platforms.
Thanks, Shelly. So today we'll take a look at iOS and Android apps. We'll start with the very simple applications that have 3 different placements, each one covering its own ad type. We'll review HTML display, native display, and native video. So let's start with iOS and let's see what the app can do. You have a banner in a scroll view with a native close button. Very similar with video, except you have a video instead of the banner. And then the native display. So let's see how we can change this app to add Om Sdk integration to each of those three placements. We have three different view controllers, and let's pause here, Shaylee.
Yeah.
So each placement has its own view controller with the, and we have a base class that each view controller inherits from. So let's take a look at the lifecycle of that view controller. Once the view controller is presented on screen, the request add method is called, and it will initiate the fetch creative with the creative URL. And once that creative is loaded, it will respond with a did finish creative method, which is what SAP classes will need to override in order to handle the ad display. Let's play. Present ad is a method that actually displays the ad container, and the responsibility of each view controller to call that method. And will present ad is a method that will be called just before the ad gets displayed, and this will likely be the perfect place for us to start measurement using the SDK. And then did dismiss ad is a method that is called just before the ad is removed from screen. That's when we'll finish the measurement session. Right, so now let's start with actually adding the SDK to the project. We'll create a new category, Om Sdk, and let's add the framework to it. So we download that from the portal. The builds are namespace. We are using namespace Pandora for this example. We added the framework. Now we need to add the Omid JS service, so we can load it in runtime. There's also an option to get that Omid JS service from the server. Now let's start with implementing the actual code in the view controllers. So as mentioned before, we'll start with the will present ad. We'll add additional methods, start measurement. The first thing we need to do is activate the SDK if it's not already active. We'll add another method activate Om Sdk just for that. We'll check if the SDK is active. If it's not active, we'll check if it's compatible with the version of the Omid JS service that we added to the project. And in our case, the API version is 1.1.1. And if it's compatible, we'll activate the SDK with this API version. Next, we'll add a property for Omid ad session. Now let's add another method, create ad session. We'll start by creating an instance of Omid partner. Just the name is your unique partner name, and then the version is the version of your app or SDK. Then we'll create the ad session context. The details of ad session context will be left out to subclasses. We'll just leave the implementation blank for now. Same with the ad session configuration. And then once that's done and we have configuration and context, we can finally create the ad session. After that, we can add the main ad view. We can add our ad container as the main ad view, and the SDK will be able to track geometry changes on this view. If you have any views that are considered friendly abstractions, we can register them as friendly abstractions. For example, in our case, we have a native close button that is part of ad interface. We'll use that as friendly abstraction. Next, we'll add a property for ad events. This is the object that we can use to register ad impression. We created an Omit ad events instance, and we used ad session as a parameter here. And then we added another method to set up additional ad events. We'll only use that for video placement to add an additional object that will handle native video ad events. And after that's done, we can finally start the measurement session. Do ad session start, and then ad events impression occurred to register Omit impression. So now when we dismiss the ad, we need to finish measurement session. But let's add finish measurement method. And we'll do ad session finish. And the one thing we will do here, we'll add a property for Omit.js service, and the getter of that property will load the contents of Om Sdk Javascript as a string. So now let's move on to the details of the HTML display placement. We'll go to Web View Controller. And we'll override the method create ad session configuration. And you can see that we are using native owner because we are registering impression natively. You also have an option to do that through JavaScript. In this case, it would be JS owner instead of native owner. And then we are creating the web ad session context using partner and the web view. So that should be enough to create the ad session. The next thing we need to do is to ensure that the HTML that we are loading includes Omit.js service. You only need to do that if you're not adding Omit.js service on the backend. So let's quickly pause here. Shaylee?
Yep, pause.
Okay, so the problem that we currently have is that the web view is presented immediately after HTML was loaded. Unfortunately, that's not enough to ensure that Om Sdk is completely operational with the web view. What we need to do instead is make sure that DOM content loaded event is received by the web view before trying to send any kind of events to it. And since presenting the ad container is also a trigger for starting the measurement session, we'll just move the presentation of the web view later in the cycle. Let's play. navigation delegate to the web view, and we'll be listening to web view navigation did finish, and then once that was received, we'll present the ad. And this is on iOS, this is equivalent of DOM content loaded. Another option would be to wait for a window load event that fires much later when the entire web view is finished loading. So if you want a pre-rendered ad, that is also an option. So one more thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that the web view is kept around long enough for session finish to fire. So we'll delay the distraction of the web view by 1 second. And that's it for the HTML display. So now we're moving on to video. Again, we start by overriding create ad session context. Let's pause here. Shelly?
Yep. Yep, got it.
Okay, so no, that's good. You can see that the parameters for Omid verification script resource are hard-coded, but in a real-world scenario, you would get those from your ad response, which would probably be a vast document. So as an example, we're providing here ad verifications node, which can be present in the vast document. And if it's present, you should parse the values from verification and load this using Omid verification script resource. Let's play.
Yes.
You can see that we have the vendor key, which is dummy vendor in our case, then the JavaScript resource URL, which we are using Omid validation verification script, which is our test script that takes verification parameters as a URL in verification parameters. Verification parameters is just an arbitrary string. It's just the setup of this particular script that it takes a URL as a parameter. And then we set up ad session context using partner the contents of Omid.js service and this verification resource array. And then the one last thing we need to do here is set up the ad session context. And once this is done, we are ready to set up an instance of Omid video events. We'll do that by overriding the setup additional ad events method so that it fires at the right time. And after that, we are ready to register all relevant video events. We'll start with a loaded event, which is takes vast properties as a parameter. In this case, it's an autoplay standalone non-skippable video. Then the next event is the start, which takes duration and player volume as parameters. We'll add another method for player volume. So the important part here is to return 0 when the player is muted. Then otherwise it's just the volume of the player. And we'll move on to quartiles. This is very similar to vast events, so you probably already have that implemented. Just you can use the same spot in your code to report Omid quartiles. And the last one here is complete. Let's see what other events we have here. Since we have a play pause button, let's also add pause and resume. And the next one is mute and unmute button. Every time the user toggles that button, will issue a volume change event with the using player volume value. And the last one here is add user interaction with a type click. We'll trigger that when the user clicks on the ad. That's it for native video. Next is native display. Again, we need to override ad session, create ad session context. This is very similar to video, except probably the format will be different. If you're using the example in the comments is using OpenRTB format, but the setup is very similar to VAST. Again, you have 3 parameters that you need to pass to Omit verification script resource, the vendor key, the URL to the measurement script, and a string of parameters. And next, we'll create the ad session context. And ad session configuration with the native impression owner and non-owner for video events, since we don't have any video events in this native type. All right, now that's done. We can run the app, and using Charles and Omit validation verification script will confirm that we implemented everything correctly, and we are able to see the events. The validation verification script will just send everything to the dummy URL that we specified, either in the parameters or in the script itself. And you can see that the session start event is firing. Then the next one, we'll just take a closer look at the payload here. The next one is impression, and there are a bunch of geometry change events. If you move the view around, more geometry change events are issued. And then we'll use the close button to dismiss the ad and confirm that session finish is present. It looks like everything looks good with the HTML display. So we'll move on to native video. Again, you see the asset is loaded and the Omit validation verification script, and session start, geometry change, first quartile, midpoint, and we tried the pause button. If we can resume, there's resume. Let's try if we can mute and unmute. The volume change should have video player volume 0 when it's muted, and then when we unmute, it's back to 1. So that looks good. And we'll just click on the ad. Takes us to the landing page. And we go back and use the close button to finish the session. That's it for iOS. Can proceed with Android.
Yep. Should I start?
Again, sure. Yeah. Again, Android has a very similar structure, just like iOS app. 3 replacements: native display, native video, and HTML display. And we have 3 fragments implementing each placement. We'll do most of the work in these fragments and in the utility classes. So we'll start by adding SDK to the project. Again, we downloaded the namespace build from the IAB portal. just drag the entire thing to the libs directory. And then we'll change the Gradle settings to use that library as a dependency. And then after that, we'll add the JavaScript, the Omit.js service script to the project. We'll create the assets directory and put it there. Okay. And then we'll add a utility class to load the contents of that script as a string. Let's call it Omit.js loader. And it will only have one method, get Omit.js, which opens the file and returns it back as a string. Now, the next thing we'll do here is we'll explore the display add HTML fragment, and looks like the main job is done by add loader class, which downloads the HTML. So we just need to make sure that this HTML includes Omit.js service. If it's not added on the backend, we'll include Omit.js service once the HTML was downloaded here. So now we have HTML contents that include Omit.js service, and we can use it for with Om Sdk and measurement scripts. Next, let's add the add session utility class. This will help us manage ad sessions. We'll start with the HTML ad session. Just like with iOS, the first thing we need to do is make sure that the SDK is active. If it's not yet active, we'll activate it with the version of the JS service that we added to the project. Then the next thing is create ad session configuration. Again, we are using the native owner for the impression event and none for video events, because this is display type. Then we create an instance of the partner object. Use the partner name Pandora, and the version name will be the version of this app. Then add session, or create an add session with the add session configuration and the context, and that's it. Now let's move back to display add HTML fragment, and let's see what is the ideal place for us to create add session. So here's the on-page finish callback that the web view receives. And the easiest place for us to create the add session is here. If on-page finished doesn't work for you, the other option is to listen to DOM content loaded JavaScript event and create the add session when that event is received. Again, it's really important not to create add session or not to start measurement too early. You have to wait for the web view to load DOM in order to ensure that Omit is completely operational. So once we created the add session, I can start the measurement, register the web view with the add session, and trigger the impression. And then when the web view is destroyed, we just call add session finish to finish the session. So the next type is the video ad. Again, we'll start with the changes to add session utility class. We'll add another method that will create the native add session. We'll have isDisplay as a Boolean parameter. to allow us to use the same method to create native ad session for display and video. In case of video, we'll use native owner for the video events. In case of display, the owner will be none because there are no video events with the display type. So again, we need to create an instance of verification resources, and we're using this ad verifications node as an example of what the real world scenario would look like. In our case, the values are hard-coded. Again, vendor key is the dummy vendor. Verification script URL is the Omit validation verification script that it hosted on a local host. And then the verification parameter is a string. In this case, it's specific to Omit validation verification and contains a URL. Then we create ad session context. And with that, we are ready to create the session. Let's go back to video ad native fragment. Let's see where we can start where we can create the ad session. First, we'll add the instance variables for ad session and the video events. And then we'll create the session in onCreate view. And we're passing is display false because this is a video type. And then we're creating video events and registering the ad container. And then finally, we are ready to start the session. The next thing to do here is to report the loaded event with VAS properties. Again, this is a standalone, non-skippable autoplay video in our case. Then we fired the impression, and now we'll look for where we can track the progress. We'll start with the video event start, which accepts duration and volume, player volume as parameters. And we'll report the first quartile, the midpoint, third quartile. Again, these are just regular VAST events. We already have that implemented. It should be very easy to add Om Sdk to that. And then on state ended, we'll fire the video events complete. After that, the buffer start, because we're not fully prefetching video in the case of Android, so there may be a case of buffering. Let's do buffer finish as well. The next is pause and resume. And the last thing here is to finish the session when the view is destroyed. That's it for the video ad. Let's quickly cover native display. We already have a method to create the native ad session. So let's just provide an instance variable for the ad session and proceed with creating the session in the onCreateView method. We'll pass is display true. We'll add the friendly abstractions, register the native banner view with the ad session, and then we can start the measurement and register impression. And the last thing here is to finish the measurement when the view is dismissed. That's it. We are ready for the Android demo. Now we just need to configure the set the proxy settings so we can use this emulator with Charles. And then we'll use validation verification script to see what kind of events the SDK was receiving. All right, here's Charles. And let's start with the native video this time. You can see there's a call to request a creative. And then the validation verification scripts is firing events to dummy domain. Again, session start, impression, geometry change, loaded event, and then start, and there looks like there are quartiles there too. First quartile, midpoint, third quartile, we paused. And then resumed. And finally, the video completed. And now we're going to destroy the view, and that will trigger the session finish event. Let's do the same for HTML display. Again, there's session start, impression event, geometry changes, everything looks good. And confirm that more geometry changes events are firing when we move the view around. And that should fire session finish event. Yep. The last thing here is the native display. Again, session start, geometry change, impression. And then finally session finish. That's it for the demo. Back to you, Shaylee. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. So the next section for today is the campaign execution. Sar from Double Verify will walk us through the various scenarios for the campaign execution. Sar?
Yeah, thank you, Shaylee. Next slide, please. So starting off, how to bid on Om Sdk Inventory is made apparent via a new ID on OpenRTB spec starting version 2.0. It's recommended that if you don't support the version, the Emery tree option, ID number 6, then you'll implement, you'll skip that and go to ID 7. Essentially, this will be available via any Ads SDK that kind of opens up an auction, will transmit it on the on the API list, on the API framework list, and also in responses will be included as a flag. Next slide, please. So kind of two scenarios or two areas to cover is kind of publisher initiated measurement versus advertiser initiated measurement. On the publisher side, measurement provider tag could be injected into the web view by the integration partner's SDK. So essentially the Ads SDK will be responsible for the execution of the tag on behalf of the publisher. And the second scenario, if a publisher has their own ad serving or some custom ad units, they may inject it themselves. On the right side, the advertiser initiated measurement is, first scenario is an advertiser provides tag to a publisher that then injects it via their own integration. And then the last one is tag is included within the creative's HTML. And as long as it's injected into the same kind of view, then web view, then it will be able to hand check and communicate with the Omid API. Next slide, please. So just deep dive into a native display a little bit. So, first off, these three parameters on the left side, top left side, are kind of the three parameters that will be needed in any execution. A vendor key is basically a string, identifies the measurement vendor. The verification resource URL is kind of the base URL for the measurement tag. And the verification parameters are basically a set of IDs representing the client, advertiser, publisher, campaign IDs, basically provided by the measurement provider. Below, you can see a JSON representation that could be used in event trackers on OpenRTB. Responses. These IDs would need an event and a method ID on the same object. We recommend ID 555. And yeah, if you're supporting kind of an older version of the spec, 1.1, then you may still use the JS tracker, but that's really deprecated in later versions, so it's preferable to use the event trackers object, and basically the JSON will be placed in the extension associated with it. Next slide, please. For video execution, the VAST 4.1 spec is upcoming. It's kind of in final stages of preparation. Again, same set of parameters need to be provided. Really, the difference between VAST 4.1 on the left side and VAST 2, 3, and 4 on the right side is in VAST 4.1, this ad verification node is kind of first class node in the XML. In kind of an earlier version, this will be an extension. So we foresee the versions 2, 3, and 4 extensions to be kind of dominant in the market in the beginning because it's easier and quicker to implement, and VAST 4.1 is not released yet, but over time, I suspect a lot of migration will happen to VAST 4.1. One thing to note is you may have multiple verification nodes within an ad verifications, and also VAST wrappers or VAST redirects may include multiple. So as you unwrap a VAST tag from a player perspective, you'll have to kind of collect all of them together and execute all of them. Next slide, please. So for summary, for video web view, publisher initiated, the measurement provider tag is inserted into the web view by the integration partner, the SDK. For advertiser initiated in a web view scenario, this will be delivered via VAST, either through the node or an extension, an earlier version of VAST. For native scenarios, publisher initiated, the tag will be generated directly and injected via directly into the web view. And for advertiser scenario, the tag will be injected via or provided via the response on the OpenRTB event tracker object. And that's it.
Thank you, sir. So the next section that we have is related to adoption, which deals with the transition, the timelines, the guidance from MRC on accreditation, and the integration validation compliance offering from the Tech Lab. So for the timeline, I will hand it over to Brad to walk us through that.
Thank you, Shelly. So to quickly recap, adoption of the OM SDK is voluntary. Though in adopting, participants help streamline how measurement data is gathered while reducing discrepancies in measurement in the process. Now, measurement providers, for their part, can go about getting the necessary inputs they need for their services more efficiently using the OM SDK, and that allows these providers to focus more intently on transforming measurement data into insight. With improved coverage rates on measurement, we expect that we will see a virtuous effect on buyer confidence, which should give buyers the reassurance that they need to transact on quality placements more frequently. And with buyer confidence a lot higher, the benefits are likely to flow to publishers and ultimately to users as well. Now, in terms of the timeline, we encourage implementing the OM SDK at the earliest opportunity, and we hope that this session has been helpful in showing you how to do that. Now, for buyers and sellers looking to leverage viewable impression measurement in time for Q4, we suggest that these buyers and sellers require their partners to integrate OM SDK support by September 30th. This will allow ample time for testing, iterating, and so on to be able to be fully live by the holidays without risk of impacts by holiday code freezes. Buyers and sellers who are ready sooner are, of course, encouraged to go live sooner. Remember, ultimately, that the timeline you follow is your own, although in saying all of this, we are encouraging the ecosystem to adopt open measurement at earliest opportunity.
Thank you, Brad. The next section is Marcie Guidance. Unfortunately, Ron could not make it to this particular session, so I'm going to cover that for him. So as you saw earlier, when Joe was talking about the initial stages of why we created the OM SDK, that was one of the things that MRC had pointed out a couple of years back, that they would definitely support, and there is a need for a standard SDK or API to be created for measuring viewability. And they have continued that support. They fully support the OM SDK, and then the mobile. But what it does is that that it still doesn't mean that we don't have to do the quality control and the auditing. We still have to go through that process. So the mobile viewability guidelines, they have the required quality control and testing for APIs and SDK included in that. They had already anticipated that. So what they've given is the guidance from them. Like currently unaccredited vendors should undergo successful accreditation audit of the use of MSDK. Those vendors or measurement providers who are already accredited by the MRC must disclaim the use as unaccredited until successfully audited by the MRCs. And that in that they may have to discuss specific use cases because every vendor is slightly different in how they process the data and how they present the data. Then there is a need to assess the initial and ongoing quality control over use at third-party publishers and developers. So MRC is working closely with the Tech Lab to get comfort with that certification process. And then this is our compliance process that we're working through with them. And then there's a need to ensure data collection, processing, editing, and reporting use of audited systems. And then need to determine the appropriate measured rate and coverage. Auditing is as part of the next recurring audit. So the vendor could easily go through that audit as part of their regular next audit in their cycle. Or they could even request an accelerated one-off, and MRC believes that it can be done efficiently and quickly. So that was a quick update on the MRC guidance. While we are on the accreditation, I also want to address the compliance service that we offer in a little bit more detail. So what we've done is we've created a repository of test cases to validate an integration based on the Mote API. As part of the compliance services, we get your app and the ad served just like you would normally do in a real world, and then we run through those test cases. There are about 90 some test cases that we run through for each ad types, and some are basic based on the session and the context, etc. And then we tabulate all those results and make sure that the API is providing the right data as expected for each test case, and then we validate or we certify that integration. So that is available through IAB Tech Lab. It's a voluntary offering. It's not something that is mandated for everyone. But the reason we designed this was that if you get that certification, it ensures that your integration will work with all the measurement providers' verification tags. And plus, it's a good test to ensure that it's been properly integrated and it's triggering the right events as expected. More information, you can send an email to compliance@iabtechlab.com, and they will provide you more information about it. Moving on from here is the roadmap. So Michael is here to help us walk through the roadmap for the future.
Thanks, Joey. So, as in terms of what comes next, the first thing to talk about is what platforms are supported via the Open Measurement SDK. Starting out, that's just going to be Android and iOS mobile applications. But in the near future, at some point in Q2, alongside the VAST 4.1 working group rollout, will be desktop and mobile web OMID support. And that's relatively important because it allows to further move away from VPaid and actually have reliable verification vendor tracking via just VAST across the majority of ad impressions being served right now. As far as further platforms in the future, Q3 and onward, there will be discussions around Windows apps, around OTT set-top devices. That's prone to changing timelines and changing expectations, but is initially expected. If you could move to the next slide. As far as a sneak peek of some of the features that are expected to come out as part of Q2, the exact prioritization and commitment is pending final review, but some of the noted items thus far can be filtered into these general categories. Starting with invalid traffic, the key goal across I think most of the vendors in the space is to have both general invalid traffic and sophisticated invalid traffic up and running. And it's worth pointing out that that is already the case for the vast majority of IVT detection. The actual development point here is to pass on any signals specifically available via the SDK and add in essentially SDK specific sophisticated invalid traffic detection mechanism. On the performance front, load speed, latency improvements, general refactors for maintainability and minimization of tech debt are all constant goals. Performance is particularly important for the SDK just because any impact to ad load speed can have critical results on key attention metrics. So minimizing the effect on the time it takes an ad to actually load and render is of pretty key importance. In terms of expansion to the existing viewability offering, beyond just initial geometric measurement, some of the slated improvements are for better debugging and more detailed vendor reporting for reasons behind the non-viewable state, essentially asking, we know the ad's not viewable, why is it not viewable, to have better metrics on that. Support for the MRC audibility standard, signals potentially being sent directly to a publisher without needing to go through a verification client script, and support for continuous view time directly via an OMID interface. On the encryption and security and general trust of the Open Measurement SDK front, probably one of the most critical things there is some kind of handshake or verification service, such that the verification vendor scripts that are being fed OMID signals have a way of knowing this is actually coming from a legitimate, unspoofed Open Measurement SDK integration. Essentially just having a way to verify all of the verification vendors going out and listening for these signals now. We have a way to confirm this isn't just a random bad actor spoofing those signals and saying I'm viewable when the ad actually isn't. In addition, there's a proposal to expand safeguards against API abuse. For example, publishers either willfully or unintentionally generating errant data or invalid impressions. And kind of the last point of that is just having a full stack automated testing suite to make sure that all of the components of the SDK, the JS service, the native service, so on, all continue functioning and pass all regression tests for any future versions. Just to make sure that the validity of the OM SDK signals are something that we can all be confident in. Brand safety, probably the biggest point of discussion currently is blocking support, both via a server-to-server signal and via a verification vendor's script call, so happening at either one of those timing points and kind of load layers. Additionally, having a signal that can be passed down to provide the app category to verification scripts for app section whitelisting or blacklisting for brand safety is a related part of the proposal. Audience, so far, relatively simple front, passing in device ID for audience and reach reporting per GDPR compliance, and then various and sundry other improvements, both for RTB improvements for declaring OMID support ahead of time to help fully transition off of VPaid, and for native ad support, better defining a standard field in RTB responses for the vendor key and verification parameters. And then one last proposal, which is adding a Swift version of the iOS SDK for better performance and easier adoption for apps coded in Swift. And that about wraps it up for the current state of Q2 proposed initiatives, again, pending prioritization and potential changes. So back to you, Shelly.
Thank you, Michael. So that brings us to the end of the show and tell webinar today. And thank you all for joining us. The URL is for this project is iabtechlab.com/OM SDK. All the information is always available there. We are going to also post the recordings of this webinar before end of this week. We'll have the presentation, we'll have the webinar, we'll have the Q&A, everything posted there for you to see, as well as the videos of the demo that Alex showed. We'll have those separately posted for developers to go and take a look at it. Regarding the yes, so if you have any issues with downloading or with integrating, we have the channel for support right now is by email. It's a simple email ID, omsdksupport@iabtechlab.com. You can always email us with any questions. We try to answer them within 24 to 72 hours. And as the downloads and the integrations ramp up and scale up, we will open up other channels like forums, etc. So right now in the working group, you can participate in the working group. This working group does require a specific participation agreement created mainly to protect the IP contributions made by all the commit group members and their teams. But once you have access, you're part of the group, you have access to a Slack channel, which is very active and very vibrant and responding. Plus, you get access to some other resources as being part of the working group. Yeah, do contact us. You can send it to, you can send a request to me, Shelly at iabtechlab.com or Sdk support at iabtechlab.com for membership into the group, as well as any other support questions you may have. We still have time for some questions. Meena, are there any questions that we can address?
Yes, so our first question is, how does the lack of support for collection of advertiser ID affect the use of macros for such ad ID collection in tags?
This is better answered by measurement providers. So Joe, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Nothing's preventing a macro from being populated to pass certain signals. I think that it's really up to the measurement provider to decide whether or not they support a given macro being populated, and that's something you should work out with your measurement provider that you're partnering with.
Okay.
Our next question is, will Om Sdk reduce some of the discrepancies between buy-side and sell-side measurement, given both sides are measuring through the SDK?
Kevin, do you want to answer? You want to take that?
Sorry. Sure. So as all the measurement vendors will be using the same Open Measurement SDK for the collection of viewability signals, the expectation is that these discrepancies between the buy-side and sell-side measurement would be reduced.
Our next question is it only the commit group that will have access to the actual source code?
The source code is available to all the members of the working group who signed the participation agreement. Commit group does, as per the agreement, reserve the right to restrict action of certain portions of code if they feel that that is necessary for examples like fraud detection or IVT related code that we may not want to expose to the general industry or public at large.
Are other viewability vendors like Integral Ad Science and Double Verify already partnered with the SDK?
Yeah, sure. Double Verify. Sar did present today. Sar, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, we're ready to collect measurement.
Same here with IAS. We're supporting actual certifications at this point right now.
Michael, you want to add about Mote?
Yep, same for us.
And a follow-up question to that is, do we need individual SDK agreements with vendors such as Mote, IAS, and Double Verify separately?
Does anyone want to take that question from the vendors?
Quick clarification. When you mean SDK agreements, do you mean a certification process?
No,
I'm not sure.
I think they're asking whether, I don't know, Meena, do you have access to ask the question? If they can ask, we can give them.
I don't have it in front of me. Sorry, guys.
I assume it's talking about the testing and certification process, at which point the recommendation would be to go through the IAB Tech Lab verification, which should function for any of the vendors. Going through individual testing via each vendor is an option, just not the recommended. As far as contractual agreements, I assume that's not what it's talking about, but that would be something where that would be a vendor-to-vendor point to take up.
So in that case, if you're receiving measurement from IAS and you had a relationship to receive, say, a UI login and measurement of the sort, there would be a separate agreement for that. But just for us to certify you, there would not be a required agreement.
Yeah, so whoever asked this question, like if this doesn't answer, please feel free to send more detailed question and we can get the answers later on.
Our next question is, what is the cost associated with implementing the OM SDK in our apps? Also, what contracts are involved?
So there is no cost to implement the OM SDK. It's like we showed you, you can just log into the portal, sign up for the portal. That's all free, and you can generate your build and get the SDK. There are no contracts involved, but the SDK does come with a license. So we encourage that you read the license and follow the terms and conditions of the OM license that comes with the SDK. Yep, there are no costs involved. The only cost is for the compliance service, that is the certification, and that is voluntary.
Can OM SDK capture device ID and pass it in a click? This would be useful for app-to-app conversion attribution.
Like we said in the presentation, at this stage, we're not capturing any IDs. The focus of the first release is to capture the viewability, and we are capturing all of that, the impression, the viewable geometry for a particular campaign. Once we have, it's part of the roadmap. We haven't yet prioritized it, but yeah. So wait for our prioritized roadmap to be published later in Q2. And
it's also important to note on that particular question that today the focus is in, but that's certainly something that we can review.
Yep.
Can we have multiple ad verification vendors in the VAS to enable multiple partners?
Sar, do you want to address that?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, in the same VAS, you may have multiple verification node, and in kind of VAS that are wrapping other VAS, you may see additional ones as well. And all of them should be executed.
Publishers are concerned about the size of the SDK. Please confirm the size.
Does anyone want to take this? I did do the size calculation earlier today, but I wasn't sure. So I think it's Mike. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Have those sizes there?
Yeah. So for Android, it's 59 KB, and for iOS is 19.4 MB.
Okay, and one last question is JS frequently updated in every 2-week sprint? If yes, then that means the app needs to be updated and pushed on store every 2 weeks. Please confirm.
Alex, do you want to address that?
It's not necessary to upgrade the SDK every 2 weeks. However, we encourage you to frequently update the JS service.
Do we have time for one more, or?
Let me add a little bit to that.
Sure.
So the OM SDK, we are following like a semantic versioning with major version dot minor fixes, and as per our current guidance that we are following, all the releases within a particular major version, like 1.x, would be backward compatible. So you don't have to necessarily upgrade every 2 weeks or every now and then. And whenever we release a significant functionality that needs to be, that you should be aware of to upgrade, we will make sure that we publicize it. But otherwise, with every release, you can always see the change log and know exactly what functionality is going into that particular release. And then the major releases, like when we go from 1.x to 2.x, may have a breaking change or have big functionality packaged into it. So that's something that you should look out for, which we are planning on. Usually would be like once a year, maybe twice a year sometimes. So that's the guidance on when to upgrade. I think one last question.
Yeah. Sure. How to participate to be a verification provider, and what is the process?
Well, that's a great question. From Om Sdk, like we are providing the software, so we are not providing any guidance on how you become a verification provider or you become a publisher or anything. That's up to you how you want to use it. The software is available, but we are not going to provide any guidance on how you start a new business or get into a new business.
Looks like we have a quick correction from Jay in the Slack channel that the iOS SDK does not add a full 19 megabytes to the app.
Okay.
That the image size is closer to 100 kilobytes.
Oh, the final compile size?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, voice was cut. Yeah, Jay also mentioned this is like the SDK standalone size is 19. Once it goes into the app and gets as an IPA at the binary, then the size is 100 KB or less.
Okay. That's great information.
Confirm.
Thanks for the update.
Once you share this.
We'll post the questions as a separate FAQ, listed FAQ, so we'll have the right answers in that for that size. Okay. Well, thank you everyone once again. Thanks for joining, and I look forward to all of you downloading the SDK and integrating the OM SDK in your apps and Ads SDKs. Thanks again.